and he's looking at this through a diplomatic lens. And my father actually fought the 1971 war. He was in the front line of action. So, and I'm here bridging, a certain gap or bridging the narratives of sort, right? So, do you think 71 was a pivotal year in terms of India-Pakistan, engagements per se? And, was it purely a military victory? And, maybe the diplomacy around it or behind it could be a start of where we can take this from?
Yeah, I think 1971 was certainly a very important inflection point in the relationship, and it came within 25 years of the creation of the two countries. And they had gone through another war in 1965, so they were trying to build ties as new countries, but 65 there was this war over the territory of Kashmir, and multiple events led up till 1971. So in many ways, and I've demonstrated it in the book, the 1971 moment was India's finest hour, the finest hour of India's comprehensive national policy, which means everything came together. The military genius of India's military planners and strategists, the political leadership, and also the diplomacy. So the diplomacy and all three had to work in concert to achieve the kind of ends that India did, which means it achieved the objective of having East Pakistan that became a free country, because India was suffering from a large number of refugees, about 10 million of them, who could then go back to their home country. But in many ways, the diplomacy was very important because Mrs. Indira Gandhi, for instance, had a strategic guru who was P.N. Huxer. And he advised her at some point, because these were very emotive, passionate times, that statesmanship is about anger management. So he said that statesmanship is about effective letting expression of anger. And once that anger has been expressed, it's effective management. Because it is important to do both rather than just do the former and forget the latter. Because the way to good policy making is to understand public opinion and take it forward in ways that only statesmen and leaders understand. So I think that was a very important moment for India and for Indian diplomacy as well.
True. Fair. And I think that's a very important point because, in the front lines, when there's war, I think diplomacy during the time of war is even more sensitive than, peace. But then, have you ever had peaceful times with Pakistan?
Yes, surprisingly, there have been. There have been times we tend to forget when we've had times of relative peace, because the foundational relationship right from the beginning has been troubled. In 1947, we had very, very severe partition riots. More than 1 million people lost their lives, and a lot of 10 to 15 million people were moved. So that was a big scar in the foundational moment. We've also had, but surprisingly, from 1947 to 65, in the earlier times before the war of 1965, the two countries actually tried to build bridges with each other, tried to treat each other with some degree of respect. In 1955, you'll be surprised to know that India invited the then Governor General of Pakistan as the chief guest for India's Republic Day parade in Rajpath. And again in 1965, the year of the war, Prime Minister Shastri invited Pakistan's dictator Ayub Khan as the chief guest. So there have been episodes in the late 70s, even in this century, in 2004 to 8, when we had relative peace and an understanding of each other, that we could go forward.
And so the period that you mentioned, right, And I'll come back to the correlation with how you have divided the book. So would you say that the period you mentioned where both India and Pakistan were relatively at peace, was it because both countries were trying to build their nations? Because it had just formed 47. We received they've formed. We're all busy building our countries to kind of be bothered with the others. Would that be a fair assumption, or was there deliberate diplomatic engagement to make sure that what you just mentioned happened?
Yes, I think it was a bit of both, because in what makes a relationship, there are multiple factors. There are structural factors. There are, the nature of the state is important. Pakistan gradually got an army which began to run the state, and therefore it had a security paranoia about India, that India will take over Pakistan. But at the same time, the quality of leadership matters, the quality of your diplomacy matters, and all that comes together. For instance, when Prime Minister Nehru in 1960 goes to Pakistan and signs the Indus Water Treaty, it is a treaty that is holding to this day. The then Indian High Commissioner in Pakistan was Rajeshwar Dayal, was instrumental in persuading Nehru that, look, this dictator is not so bad. Maybe you should engage with him, and maybe you should try and understand what he has to say. So I think both things matter, the quality of the leaders as well as the quality of
fair enough,
diplomacy.
Fair enough. And coming back to the book, Ajay's book is structured in 8 parts, basically across 8 decades, right? And each decade has its own significance and twists and turns to it, right? So one of the initial questions I asked Ajay was, is this your story? So maybe you could take it.
Yeah, sure. So, the book is actually divided into 8 decades, and it's trying to tell the story from 1947 till 2023, taking it one decade at a time and explaining the global events that happened and what happened between the two countries. And each decade had a certain dynamic of its own and a certain, kind of set of events. Even there was some military action, some diplomatic action, some treaties, all of that built on this relationship as it is today. But the interesting thing about the way is that all these events is that you can't really predict the way they will happen. So the leadership at that point matters, and there is a certain accident in history. So you could argue that there's a great men theory, that great men or women can come as leaders and change the course of history, or there is a structural factor and an inevitability to history. So we experience both these dynamics.
Right. I think it's also a factor of the leaders at that point and the advisors at that point. And like you mentioned, when somebody's telling you, hey, give the guy a chance, hear him out, right? It makes a lot of difference as to let's not even bother. Yeah. So yeah, it makes a lot of sense. And so is there a particular point after 47 maybe that it particularly went sour? The relationship kind of, hey, this is really going downhill. Was there an influx point as such, or maybe something that triggered?
Yes, so I think there was a structural problem in Pakistan. So the argument I've made is right in the first essay about the factors that have populated the relationship. They include the issues of territory, of security, and ideology. And Pakistan's own identity crisis about what it was, it always wanted to be the other of India, that it could not define exactly what kind of nation it wanted to be. So in the initial years, all the attempts were going well, reasonably well, to building newer states. But for Pakistan, somehow in its foundational myths, there was the story that Pakistan is incomplete without getting Jammu and Kashmir to be part of it. And because of this, they developed what is now called a culture of a strategic culture of revisionism or persistent revisionism, which means that they felt they were incomplete without getting the territory of Jammu and Kashmir. So I think the 1965 war, that poisoned things, because it was taken, Pakistan was under a dictatorship of Ayub Khan from 1958, and suddenly he probably had too much whiskey one day and decided that he wanted to go and conquer Kashmir. And with a small clique of officers, and without considering the implications very carefully, he went to the first war.
And that's quite scary also, right? If you could just do that on whim. But I think it went, plus, so I think about this, right? So we watch the narrative, we hear the news, we hear what's happening between India and Pakistan. There's history, there's war, there is everything being created. But somebody like Ajay has his fingerprints on parts of it, right? Or the entire diplomatic community and the ministry and all of that. So, how do you kind of, I won't say change, but manure, this particular journey across governments, but diplomats stay, possibly, right, through different, political regimes that might come in. So isn't that like as you say, the anger management needs to be quite, it has to be a bit consistent too, right? Because you can't suddenly, like you said, you can't wake up one day and say, I'm going to war with, Pakistan. You can't do that, I think.
Exactly. I think the challenge before diplomats is in a tough adversarial relationship. This is a story of an adversarial relationship between two neighbors, India and Pakistan, but it could be any two adversarial neighbors in the world. And the challenge before their diplomats, their representatives, is how to be creative within that negativity to look for those solutions that could improve matters and change the situation and serve their national interests. So I think when you're a diplomat positioned in a difficult country, that is the challenge, that you need to be engaging, understanding, and contributing to policy here. And in Pakistan, for Indian diplomats, we have the additional paradox that you may have hostility in the morning, you could have some good discussions with other diplomats in the afternoon, but in the evening you could be at a home of a Pakistani, and over whiskey, all this animosity melts away and the cultural intimacy comes and they both listen to Lata Mangeshkar songs together. So this is one of the paradoxes you face when you deal with this relationship, when people who were one country only 7.5 decades ago are now running different countries, still have this cultural commonality, but need to deal with each other as hostile countries.
Right, and you're right, because there's so much of similarity. The music, there's sport. Even though there is rivalry, there's still a fundamental similarity that kind of ties us all somewhere. So it's kind of like a paradox, as you rightly mentioned. And I'm going to slightly take you into a phase where I know that you worked closely with Vajpayee ji, and that was a period where Kargil happened. So, and I'll come to the next phase of your personal journey and the book, right, wherein you're actually posted when there was tension happening. So these are two scenarios where, one, you kind of are part of handling the narrative from the most powerful office here, and one, you are actually on site and as the ambassador there. So maybe the first part with Vajpayee ji and around the war.
So the Vajpayee's dealing with Pakistan was always special for him, because he wanted to be the one who could possibly bring peace between the countries. And he was also, ironically, the Prime Minister who made India nuclear in 1998. But he had first gone to Pakistan as Foreign Minister in 1978, and it was a charm offensive. He really charmed Pakistan quite a bit. And in his second coming in 98, he was the one who made India nuclear. Pakistan had its tit for tat nuclear tests in May 98. But he was also responsible for the biggest and boldest diplomatic initiative India has perhaps taken in 76 years, which means he got into a bus and said, I will go to Lahore. Right after, a few months after he had, both countries had gone nuclear. And it was then, ironically, Nawaz Sharif who will be possibly the Prime Minister of Pakistan in a couple of days. Again, but he went there on this initiative of going to Pakistan and trying to diffuse a situation which was, with both countries having gone nuclear, a possible flashpoint. And he dealt with Musharraf at and the Kargil War. And I joined right after the Kargil War, his office, and I was his secretary for 5 years. But one of the first crises we faced was a hijacking of an Indian aircraft from Nepal into Pakistan, and that was a very traumatic time in 1999, and it became my job to tell the Prime Minister in the car, sir, a plane has been hijacked. It's possibly Pakistan, so we have to immediately go into a crisis meeting. So I think those were really interesting times in the Vajpayee days. Pakistan was a constant theme in that relationship in those times.
Right. And you would think that, you did make progress at one point, and then kind of you took 2 steps forward and maybe 5 or 6 steps back when the war came in. And it seems to happen in cycles. Each time there's a step forward and something happens too. Is that a planned narrative from the other side? Is it because there's too much of what the military would want in that region from Pakistan's end?
So I think that's a $1 million question, and it's a complex question. Why do we get into trouble? Because it tends to be cyclical. And I would argue in the last 3 decades, it's been terrorism that's been the deal breaker, right? We try to go forward, there's an act of terrorism. So we try to move forward in Kargil, before Kargil with this Lahore bus journey. And incidentally, you told me to tell you any story of that. So it was so interesting that in this bus journey, Vajpayee took all of the cultural greats and personalities of India, apart from the political ones. So the Chief Minister of Punjab was there, but also Deva Anand, the actor, and others. And when his office was working out, they just had 2 or 3 days to work it out. A friend of Vajpayee was Nasli Wadia, who was the grandson of Jinnah, the founder of Pakistan. And somehow they said in all this confusion, they forgot to take him, because they felt that it would have been a great statement to say that the grandson of Jinnah himself had come. And another name that was tossed around in the PMO then was of Madhuri Dixit, the actress, because they said that she's a very popular figure in Pakistan, and they had almost decided to take her, but then suddenly somebody pointed out, look, if we take her, that will become the story. It'll be that Madhuri Dixit goes to Pakistan. So do we want that story as the headline? And therefore they decided not to do that. So, a lot of what goes into these big moves that become headlines is a great deal of planning that goes into it. But in Vajpayee's time, there was this step forward, and then Kargil was a step back. But terrorism was the deal breaker. So, the terrorism that India faced in December 2001 in Parliament, that became a reason for all these positive steps to stop. And yet, Vajpayee said that we'll continue, and in 2004, he went to Pakistan again.
Correct. And this brings me to the next phase, as I mentioned, where you were the ambassador to Pakistan, and Pulwama kind of happened, and all that happened around it, right? So, I'm sure this You've mentioned this, but would you like to elaborate a little bit for the folks out here?
Sure. So, it was almost 5 years ago. It was the 14th of February, 2019. And in my tenure in Pakistan, the 2 years that I spent, we tried to take baby steps forward to build trust in the relationship, releasing prisoners, talking of some of the positives, some of the humanitarian things, trying to get a ceasefire on the border. And there was always this fear that if a big terrorist incident happens, we are set back, that the relationship freezes, and we get into a war-like situation, or we get into real trouble. So when this happened, I was sitting in Islamabad, saw the ticker. We said a few Indian soldiers were killed. We thought it was the usual grenade attack. But when it became clear that 40 Indian soldiers had been killed, or armed personnel of the CRPF, that became a serious crisis. So the Indian cabinet met. I was asked to immediately rush back. I ducked calls from the Pakistan Foreign Office, and I rushed back, catching whichever flight I could. And after that, in India, a lot of events took place until finally India gave an answer in Balakot, where the first airstrike since the 1971 war took place. There was a to and fro, and yet after all this, within a month of all that, I was back in Pakistan. So we said we will again try to revive the relationship and go forward. So it's very cyclical, but a deal breaker for India is the terrorism events. India's tolerance of terrorism is going down. And now it has entered Pakistan's calculation after Balakot that if there is any other terrorist incident of that scale, it will get a response which will be off the scale of Balakot. So therefore, the cost of that low-cost proxy warfare has gone up for Pakistan's army, and hopefully it will be a strong disincentive for Pakistan's army to attempt that.
Right. And, behind the scenes stuff on this. So, again, in your book, right, it was mentioned that Modi didn't take Imran Khan's call, right? He just, was that a statement, a strong statement? Was India on the verge of going to war?
Well, the situation, we're talking of the 26th of February, where India had conducted the strikes, and on the 27th of February, Pakistan tried to enter India's airspace, and India's aircraft chased down Pakistan's aircraft, and one aircraft was shot. The pilot, Abhinandan Varthaman, was in Pakistani custody, and he was a prisoner of war from that point. And it was at this point that India made it clear that the pilot needs to be released by global protocols, Geneva protocols, and all other global understanding, and there was no negotiation with Pakistan on this issue. So he had to be returned. And I think that is the time at midnight I got a call on behalf of Imran Khan that he wanted to speak to PM Modi, and I checked, and I told them that if there's any message, it could be given to me. At that point, my Prime Minister was not available, is what I said. But those are the tense moments in these conversations, because that we are talking of issues of war and peace. And we finally took that call, and it was a successful episode of India's coercive diplomacy, because the pilot was returned to India unharmed.
It is huge. It is a huge victory. And we've seen the pilot being returned to India, but probably the first time we are hearing about what went on behind the scenes, it's an absolute privilege to get to know that. And you're absolutely right. Those decisions and those moments can actually change the course of India's history, and so Pakistan's as well. So it's an amazing, tense moments, I would think. So how important are, so we talk about India and Pakistan, but there is a whole ecosystem of other countries around. that we've been engaging, since the beginning. Uh, and traditionally, we have seen that the U.S. and China kind of back Pakistan, and possibly the USSR, that erstwhile USSR was more of the powerful ally that India had, right? So do you see that dynamic change, and how did that help before and across time of these decades that you mentioned? How has that equilibrium kind of changed?
Absolutely. I think you're right. All through in this relationship, it is not just a relationship between two countries, India and Pakistan. There's global geopolitics at play. The partition moment itself was why did the British Empire want to divide and quit when it was dividing and ruling India? Because one of the factors was that there was an additional incentive for the British to create a Pakistan which was sympathetic to its interests. So Pakistan was treated as a country that would possibly defend or help defend from the threat from the USSR, which the British perceived that it wanted to attack India, and to defend the oil wells in the Middle East. And they felt that India under Nehru would not be so pliant as a new Pakistan could be once it had been created. You talked of the 1971 moment where your father was involved in the warfare. There again, the big powers were playing a major role. So, in fact, at precisely that point, the Americans, Nixon and Kissinger, were making a bridge to China. Remember, China was a communist country. They were fighting this battle with the other communist USSR that was at its peak. So he decided to make overture to China and use Pakistan as the bridge. So the Americans ignored all the human rights abuses in East Pakistan and the killings and genocide there in order to further their interests. And so it was again a tribute to Indian diplomacy that it interpreted what was happening in the US. With the Soviet Union, India sealed the Indo-Soviet Friendship Treaty in 1971, which became such a huge treaty of friendship because it essentially was a message to the Americans and Chinese that, look, guys, if you step into this war, the USSR will step into this war. The Chinese, India interpreted that they will not step into this war because in the diplomacy, our diplomat there was interpreting Mao's smile. And Mao's smile, in a sense, he was interacting with Chinese diplomats, and his assessment was the Chinese won't jump into this. So that gave the Indian army and the Indian leadership confidence to do what it needed to do without worrying for the powers to come in. And even in this day and age, these powers are very important because what has happened after the withdrawal of the United States from Afghanistan is that the geostrategic use of Pakistan for China as well as the US has gone down. The value has gone down. So Pakistan, with its very, very troubled economy, was living through what are called geopolitical rents. That means take money from the US, from the IMF, from China, and sell your geostrategic location. But all this seems to have dried up now because the US has withdrawn from Afghanistan, its equities there have gone down. Even China has less use for Pakistan in a geostrategic sense. So how the major powers deal with this area is also very important. The US-India relationship, for instance, is now a factor for Pakistan to worry about because it feels that they are very close. But it needs both the US and China to keep its economy growing because unless it develops a strong and maintains a strong relationship with the US, it feels it won't get the IMF loans.
Plus the terrorism aspect within the country is also a bothersome fact for, I think, all of these countries in some way, because I think they had promoted it in some ways for a certain, low, below the belt strategic kind
Yeah.
of thing, but then it's kind of backfiring at the moment. But at the same time, while the U.S. hold is kind of, loosening a bit, would you still think China is kind of moving into that role for Pakistan?
Well, the Chinese are, I think, conflicted because for China, the China-Pakistan relationship is not new. It has gone on from the 50s. But what used to be a relationship of strategic, strategic alliance, because your enemy's enemy is my friend. It was a strategic partnership between the two countries, but now it's one of abject economic dependence. So, because Pakistan's economy is floundering, it needs Chinese largesse. And but the value of Pakistan for China has gone down. The basic strategic value remains, but they are not too happy with the way Pakistan uses terrorism. And in fact, even they accuse Pakistan of giving shelter to some terrorists, the Uyghur terrorists who are active in China. So I think a lot of the Pakistan's neighbors are troubled by this proxy warfare and safe havens for terrorists, including to an extent China and the US. And certainly the US, we discussed the Osama bin Laden episode. The most wanted man in the history of the world was found in 2011 right next to a Pakistani military camp. So I think it's something the world worries about.
It is. And so bringing it back to the book. So when the book was released, there was a fair bit of critique from Pakistan, especially in terms of the airstrikes and possibly the book is fueling Indian bravado, and maybe the timing is because the general elections are around the corner. So what do you kind of think of that?
Well, right in the beginning, when there were some stories around the book about the missiles and about coercive diplomacy, so surprisingly, Pakistan's Foreign Office issued an official statement and said that this is a fictionalized account, this is not correct. And they also admitted at the same time they hadn't read the book. They had only read the excerpts that appeared in the Indian papers. So my reaction to that was I would advise friends in Pakistan to please read the book. So hopefully they would have read it. I saw that in Pakistan's Dawn newspaper there was a very positive kind of review of the book, because it's not about one night, this book. It's about 76 years, and in the end it's a reflection of where we can go when we turn 100. Will we be shooting for a century in 2047, or will we find ways to live with each other as many formerly adversarial countries have done in the world, like France and Germany, or East or West Germany? So I think those are the questions that Pakistan must also ask itself, because all these policies have not helped Pakistan's own case, its own economy.
And that's very true, especially unless there's the economy that grows, infrastructure, education, and healthcare, all those pillars, unless it grows, I think the whole country will be in tatters as such. And so the book, I think, because the way it's treated, it kind of would work as a guide, something that people can refer to. And as they say, right, you don't have to go through history to learn history, and then learn from it and possibly adapt to go forward. So I think that's a brilliant, book or a reference point for both countries, diplomats and people involved in policy making, to kind of refer to and keep in mind, because it's chronicled well, and it's got all the elements in it. So the million-dollar question comes to, where does this end? When does it stop? Or how do we just, fix this? I know we haven't been able to do it in 76 odd years, but can we do it? When can we do it? How can we do it? Is there something that you have in mind that points to that direction?
Well, it's a hard question, but when you write a book, you can dispense free advice, whether anyone takes it or not. So, as you said, this is a practitioner's account of the diplomacy from 15th August 47 to 15th August 2023, but it is sandwiched, it's a chronological account, and it's the account of Indian diplomats, Pakistani diplomats, Indian leaders, Pakistani leaders, global events, global diplomats. But it also is sandwiched between an essay in the beginning which reflects on some of the issues that have troubled us, the anger, and where that anger comes from. It comes from issues of security, of ideology, of territory. But in the end, it's also a reflection of where we can go. So I've called it history's ambiguous lessons. History doesn't always teach you clear lessons, but they are ambiguous lessons, but we need to draw and learn from that history on where we go forward in the next 2.5 decades, and whether we can fix this problem and find a way forward. So maybe we can't become the best of friends, but you can change your friends, you can't change your neighbors. So there have to be ways that we can manage our interests and manage each other.
Like you decide to kind of coexist.
Exactly.
And we might not like each other, but we can still be civil and coexist.
Exactly. So I think the reflection in the end is, and I've talked of scenarios. So a conditional optimism, a conditional pessimism, and a business as usual. And I argue that with a set of smart policies, we can be conditionally optimistic and take this relationship to a place where we can at least fix and manage some of the problems that we have.
Fair. And do you think the elections are on now? Do you think that would have an impact on this journey? Of course it will, but maybe Sharif is coming back in all possibility. Think that will kind of upset the equilibrium again, or?
No, I think it's positive. And I argue in the book that the elections are always a good time in any difficult relationship, because what happens is that you have new governments in place, and new governments mean fresh mandates, fresh thinking. Now, however flawed the process is in Pakistan, this is supposed to be the most rigged election ever in the history of Pakistan in recent memories. It's also been the most predictable, and despite the fact that Imran Khan's PTI probably would have coasted to a 2/3 majority if he was not in prison and his party's symbol wasn't taken away and everyone forced to stand as independence, he would have won. Yet, what we will see possibly is a coalition government with the PTI out of it. And it will be the Nawaz Sharif's party, the PMLN, as the senior partner. They have about 73 seats in this House of 266. And with the PPP of Bilawal Bhutto as the junior partner. So what we will see in the next day or two is probably a coalition government supported by the army, dependent on the army. So make no mistake, it is an army-supported government. And therefore, I feel that when we have our own elections in India, in the second half of the year, we have the possibility of moving forward in this relationship, because I feel that the army is also rethinking its position on India. All its old policies are not giving it the kind of dividends it expects. So hopefully, we can only say hopefully because this is an accident-prone relationship, it gets blown up very often, but we may have movement forward in the second half of the year.
And in fact, that was my next point, because all throughout you have seen there's definitely a strong influence of the army. And how much would that matter, with the new elections and the new government, was something that I was about to. You mentioned that they're quite open.
But that's a great question, and this is what is being asked by Pakistan analysts and global analysts at this point, because this vote that came on the 8th of February is an overwhelmingly anti-army vote. It is a vote really against the army, the martyrdom of Imran Khan and a sympathy vote for him was important, but it's an anti-army wave and and a pro-Imran wave by a largely young Pakistani population. More than 70% are very young people. And this, I think, is reason for the army to rethink, because it had a rethink moment last year on the 9th of May when there was complete mayhem on the streets when Imran Khan was arrested, and there were dissensions within the army and a lot of anti-army sentiment. But on the 8th of February, it was proven that what happened on the 9th of May was no accident. There is a strong anti-army mood. People want the army to get out of politics. And I think if the army draws the right lessons and decides to move out gradually of politics, that will be good for Pakistan and perhaps good for India-Pakistan relations.
Fantastic. So maybe in closing, right, I mean, is there anything else in the book that you would want to highlight that we've maybe not touched on? I think we've done most
We've
of it.
talked about that book, so I'm only going to recommend, please read the book.
Yes, please, it's
There's a lot
fantastic.
more there.
It's fantastic. And, you know, as a last possibly point, we did speak about, you know, the book is titled Anger Management, but we did discuss something interesting where anger can be wisely used at certain points. And you had given me an example of the, you know, something that happened at the UN. Maybe something fascinating for the audience.
Yeah, so we had a discussion on anger. Anger can often be deployed, and in politics, anger is often deployed as a weapon. It becomes an instrument, sometimes in diplomacy, and we see a lot of grandstanding and anger in the United Nations. So we've seen a lot of it in the Israel-Palestine context, that people express a lot of anger because they're supposed to be reflecting the anger of the people. The diplomats are expressing it. But in 1971, when there was an attempt to have a ceasefire in the relationship, and the UN was supposed to pass a resolution on that, Zulfikar Ali Bhutto, who was then the foreign minister, he stood up in New York and he dramatically took the resolution and he tore it into 4 parts, and he said, here's your resolution, I don't want you, I don't want this resolution, I don't want the United Nations, I'm walking out of here. So, at that point it seemed that he just lost control and became angry, but it turns out that there was a method in his anger, that he actually wanted the army of Pakistan to be humiliated. He actually wanted the East Pakistan to become a separate state, because that gave him a viable West Pakistan to be rolling over, and an army that was decimated, demoralized, so that as a civilian politician he could express his or assert his supremacy over the army.
Fantastic. It's a great point on how anger, can be managed, at the same time can be used wisely for, a particular policy or a particular thought process that you would want to emphasize. I'd like to leave it open for questions.
Yes.
Yes, please. It's a fantastic topic. I'm sure there are a lot of questions.
So my first point, Afghanistan in the current state. For Pakistan, Afghan is important in terms of the strategic depth what Afghanistan gives them, and the way China wants to have its expansion. How is this going to be important for India? First question. The second one is my opinion. Of course, I read about this from papers and books. I read a lot about Kissinger. I've read about Ishtaq Mohammed and many other Pakistani authors. I always personally felt with whatever work the bureaucracy or the government has been doing, we have had a laid-back approach to our foreign policy. Is New Delhi more focused on Islamabad than being focused on Rawalpindi to get the right results?
Yeah, thank you. 2 good questions. I think on the Afghan piece, the Pakistan obsession of strategic depth is something that Pakistan itself has had to re-examine. because this has been a sort of strategic obsession which has been a problem, in fact, for Pakistan. Now, what happened in Pakistan on the 15th, or in Afghanistan on the 15th of August 2021, in 2 years, since 2.5 years since then, has turned out to be a nightmare for Pakistan. When the US troops left after 20 years in Afghanistan in chaotic conditions, Pakistan felt that they had won strategically. The DG of the ISI, he went there and had tea with the Taliban, helped in them making their cabinet. Pakistan had also advised them on how to take over the country. And there was a sense that Imran Khan then said, the Prime Minister said, the Afghans have broken the shackles of slavery. The Americans were out, and Pakistan felt it had Afghanistan all to itself. It had three conditions for the Taliban. One, recognize the Durand Line. Two, control the TTP, the Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan, which was attacking Pakistan within it. And three, keep the Indians out. 3 years later, all those three conditions have not been met. The Tehreek-e-Taliban Pakistan is the biggest security threat, and the Taliban in Kabul says, we won't be talking to these guys. You have a dialogue with them. We can't control them. The Durand Line is not recognized. This has been Pakistan's dream forever, but they don't recognize, the Pashtuns don't recognize it, and there's a Pashtun-Punjabi tension there. And India is back with a coordination mission, and the Talibanis are refusing to condemn India in any way. So I think that myth of strategic depth and that feeling in any case was overstated, that India could have a pincer move, or the Pashtuns could have a pincer move on Pakistan, was an overstated fear and paranoia which the army genuinely believed it or wrongly believed. The other question is, again, a very important policy dilemma for India on who do you deal with in Pakistan? Do you deal with Rawalpindi or do you deal with Islamabad? And my own recommendation, including in the book, is that we should be dealing with Pakistan as it is and not as we would like it to be. And that is realpolitik. We are not in the business of reforming Pakistan. That's for the people of Pakistan to do. But if the army in the foreseeable future will be the most important force in Pakistan, we better deal with it. And even if we deal with the civilians, like Nawaz Sharif or Shehbaz Sharif, whoever will be in power, we ought to be triangulating all our policies with the army and ask them, hey guys, are you okay with this? We don't want that we have a deal here and you want to blow it up. And we've seen that in recent history, right? When Vajpayee went in 99 on his bus ride to Lahore, it was the finest agreement we got, the Lahore Declaration, and multiple other agreements on nuclear confidence building, economic and so on. But the General Musharraf thought it was all hot air. He said that. It's all hot air. And he invaded Kargil within a month of that. When Modi went in 2015, the army thought this wasn't right. It's a gate crash, and they felt Nawaz Sharif had no right to invite him to Pakistan. So the army feels entitled to taking these major India decisions, and I feel that we ought to have a way, covert, overt, of dealing with the army and triangulating whatever we agree with the civilians in order to, have policy that is sustainable.
Sir, considering the present scenario in Pakistan, would you consider Pakistan as a failed state like some of the states in Middle East, and which in turn can be danger for India, like the Middle Eastern people, many of them are migrating to West Europe, causing problems there? The Pakistani youth unemployed can flood into India, like years back Bangladeshis were coming into India. Can such a scenario would utilize?
Thank you. I think the question, for those who haven't heard it, is Pakistan a failed state? And this is something which has been debated for long. And my answer would be no. Pakistan is a dysfunctional state. It's an abnormal state. It's a state run by an army which feels entitled to own it. But it's not a failed state in the sense that it still muddles along, it still functions. So, I would say that we need to war game every scenario. So, what you've said is it's a conceivable scenario in the future that Pakistan deteriorates further, breaks up, and there is a definite fear, given the huge polycrisis it is going through, including a major economic crisis, that there will be lots of refugees who would want to run and come to India, that is a possibility. But right now, in the foreseeable future, there is no such danger. It continues to be a dysfunctional state, but India's primary objective is that it shouldn't be a terrorism exporting state. If we stop Pakistan from becoming a country which deploys terrorism and cross-border terror, we are good and we can deal with Pakistan.
Sahir. So my question is regarding the Balakot airstrike, and what are the lessons that India got to discuss at the government, at the highest level? What are the lessons that you people discussed in terms of getting the narratives right? Because even to this day, there are questions regarding the evidence that the Air Force have or the government has in terms of what we achieved there. And I've seen your interview with Karan Thapar, where you said that the priority is not about getting the evidence; it's about achieving the objective there. So without evidence, controlling the narrative, and also the question is related to how in the current political climate, the bureaucracy, the Air Force, and everyone are getting pulled into this controversy of them standing with the government regardless, without any evidence, without any credible evidence. So how do you deal with that as a bureaucrat?
I think I'm glad you raised this question. It's an important point, and the point I have been making about Balakot is that it was a hugely successful operation in a strategic sense. The evidence is strategic. If you compare it with the 2016 surgical strikes, where Pakistan said, no, nothing happened. It was in denial. 2019 Balakot, Pakistan did not deny that Indian aircraft went into its territory, dropped munitions there, and came back. And this was the point, that for the first time since 1971, the Indian aircraft crossed the international border and dropped munitions and bombs in Pakistan. It was an important statement that India made about the intolerance of terrorism. Now, the question of evidence or no evidence, the point I made was the evidence is there. On the basis of that evidence, India has said on the day of the strikes that a certain number of people were killed. On that evidence was also made available and was published in some media sources, including the spice bombs making holes in the roofs of those buildings. But my occupation in my book is not about evidence or lack of it. It is about the strategic point that India made, which was the most dramatic point India had made since 71, which I believe is what has been established a major and credible deterrent to further acts of terrorism from Pakistan. So I think that is the more important strategic point of Balakot, that it has told Pakistan that if ever there were to be another Pulwama, there would be a Balakot plus, so the cost is very high of executing that.
Would it also be fair to add on that, like we discussed, the entire U.S. operation of going in and getting Osama, and here's India kind of taking a similar, very bold step of going into their airspace and taking out terrorist locations. A very bold statement and a very strong stand to take, right?
Absolutely. So I think this is in a sense analogous to what the US did in 2011 in Zero Dark 30, as mentioned in the movie. So US aircraft went in and took out a terrorist, right? This is exactly what Iran did a few weeks ago, and this is what Afghanistan says it should have done with the Quetta Shura and the Haqqaniya network, which was targeting Afghans all through the US Times. So I think the point is that all of Pakistan's neighbors and even the distant neighbors like the US are making the point that if you give safe havens to terrorists, we feel we have a right to take out those terrorists in your territory.
Thank you so much. Been a fantastic audience. Thank you, Ajay. So many insights, so many
Thank you.
behind
Thank
the
you very much.
scenes.